My name is Ethan, and I am a rational man. Or at least I was. Before Iowa. Before the quiet, unassuming White House on East 2nd Street. My life was built on a foundation of observable facts and logical conclusions. As a journalist, it was my trade. I dealt in evidence, in verified sources, in the tangible world. Ghosts, spirits, the supernatural. They were the currency of clickbait sites and late-night television, fodder for the gullible, not subjects for a serious writer. My girlfriend, Maya, understood this, but she also understood the part of me that was growing restless. I was tired of writing sterile, soulless pieces about zoning laws and city council meetings. I was professionally adrift, craving a story with teeth, something that would challenge not just my readers, but me. That's how the idea of the Villisca Axe Murder House was born. It was meant to be a simple, atmospheric piece, a debunking. A skeptic's night in America's most haunted house. A catchy title, a weekend away with Maya, and a story that would write itself. The vulnerability was my ambition, my desire to prove that even in the face of manufactured fear, logic would prevail. The drive into Villisca was like traveling back in time. The flat, endless plains of Iowa gave way to a town that seemed preserved in amber, a relic of a bygone era. The house itself was disappointingly normal under the afternoon sun. A simple two-story wooden structure with a welcoming porch. It looked like any other house on the block, except for the subtle, almost imperceptible weight that seemed to press down on it. A stillness that felt less like peace and more like exhaustion. Our tour guide, an elderly man named George, with eyes that had seen too many tourists, and perhaps something more, recited the grim history with a practiced weariness. On a June night in 1912, the Moore family, 2 parents, their 4 children, and 2 young girls visiting for a sleepover, were bludgeoned to death in their beds with an axe. The killer was never found. He spoke of the town's enduring trauma, the covered mirrors, the uneaten meal left on the kitchen table. And then came the ghost stories, the disembodied voices of children, the falling lamps, the toys that moved on their own. I scribbled notes, a faint, condescending smile on my face. It was all part of the performance, the local folklore that kept the tourists coming. As night fell, the house transformed. The mundane corners of the rooms, once filled with the flat light of day, now pooled with an inky, impenetrable darkness. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of dust and something else, something vaguely metallic and sweet, like old blood. We laid our sleeping bags out on the floor of the living room, directly below the children's bedrooms. Maya was already on edge, her laughter a little too loud, her movements a little too quick. "It's just an old house, May," I said, my voice echoing unnaturally in the silence. Every creak and groan has a rational explanation. The first seed of fear was planted subtly, just as the legends promised. It was the sound of a single marble, dropped on the wooden floorboards upstairs, rolling slowly, deliberately, from one end of the room to the other before stopping directly above our heads. I held my breath, listening. It had to be a mouse, or the house settling. I explained it away, my voice a bastion of calm I didn't entirely feel. Maya squeezed my hand, her knuckles white. An hour later, as we were drifting into an uneasy sleep, we both heard it. A faint, childish sigh, seemingly right beside my ear. I sat bolt upright, my heart hammering against my ribs. The room was empty. "The wind," I whispered, more to myself than to her. "It's just the wind in the chimney." But there was no wind that night. The air was unnervingly still. The world outside our windows was a silent, black void. We were alone, utterly and completely alone in a house saturated with a century of pain. And something was waking up. The illusion of control, the bedrock of my rational mind, began to fracture around 2 a.m. It wasn't a sudden, violent break, but a slow, creeping erosion. A small red rubber ball, one of the many toys left by visitors for the child spirits, sat at the top of the steep, narrow staircase. I had made a mental note of it earlier. Now, as if nudged by an unseen hand, it began to bounce. Thump, thump, thump. One step at a time it descended, the sound echoing through the house like a macabre heartbeat. It came to a perfect rest between my sleeping bag and Maya's, a silent, playful invitation. Maya let out a muffled sob. "Ethan, that's not the house settling. We need to leave." But I couldn't. A cold, obsessive curiosity had taken root in my gut, eclipsing my fear. This was the story. This was real. I had to understand it. "Just a little longer," I pleaded, my voice shaky. "I need to document this." This was my folly, the moment my journalistic ambition morphed into a dangerous form of denial. I began to set up my equipment, my hands trembling as I positioned a digital camera and a sensitive audio recorder in the living room. As I moved a dusty, dilapidated dresser to get a better angle, my fingers brushed against something wedged behind it. It was another audio recorder, a slightly older model, its plastic casing cracked and grimy. Its power light was dead. Driven by a sudden, inexplicable urge, I swapped its memory card with a fresh one from my bag and plugged it into my laptop. Most of the files were corrupted, nothing but a wall of digital static. But a few were salvageable. I clicked on the first one. The hiss of static filled my headphones, and then a voice. A man's voice, strained and breathless. Log entry, November 4th, 2014. "The children are active tonight. They don't like the light. They whisper in the dark." The recording cut out. I frantically opened the next file. More static, then a different sound. A high-pitched, ethereal giggle, followed by a child's voice. A whisper so clear it felt like it was being spoken directly into my brain. "Want to play a game?" A cold dread, colder and more profound than any I had ever known, washed over me. The man's voice returned on the final playable file, no longer a calm investigator but a man on the verge of hysteria. "The game. Oh God, the game is hide and seek. But they're not hiding. They want you to hide. He's seeking. He's always seeking. The axe. I can hear the axe. They told me he never left." The file ended with a sickening, wet thud and a scream that was abruptly cut short. My blood ran cold. I scrambled to get a cell signal, my fingers fumbling with my phone. I typed the date and Villisca missing person into the search bar. My heart stopped. An obscure news article from a local paper. A paranormal investigator from Wisconsin, Robert Kellerman, had been reported missing by his family. His car was found abandoned near the Villisca Axe Murder House in early November 2014. He was never seen again. He had left his recorder behind. A warning. "Maya, we're leaving. Now." My voice was a choked whisper. I turned to look at her, to pull her up, to get us out of that cursed place. But she wasn't looking at me. She was staring at the top of the stairs, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. I followed her gaze. In the deep shadows of the landing, I could just make out a small figure, the size of a child, standing perfectly still. And then, from the darkness, the same whisper from the recorder slithered down the stairs and into the room, filling the oppressive silence. "Want to play a game?" That's when the house came alive. It was no longer a series of subtle bumps and whispers. It was a direct, malevolent assault. The friendly invitation from the top of the stairs was a declaration of war. A lamp in the corner flew across the room, shattering against the far wall. The front door, our only escape, slammed shut with a concussive boom that shook the entire frame of the house. I lunged for the knob, twisting and pulling with all my might, but it wouldn't budge. It felt as if it had been welded shut. "Help me," I screamed at Maya, but she was gone, lost to a terror I couldn't comprehend. She was curled into a ball on the floor, her hands over her ears, rocking back and forth, muttering incoherently. I was completely, utterly alone. The spirits of the children were no longer playing. The playful whispers were replaced by a cacophony of giggles, mocking and cruel, that seemed to come from all directions at once. Then came the sound from the downstairs bedroom, the room where the Stillinger girls had died. A heavy, rhythmic thump, thump, thump. The sound of an axe blade biting deep into wood, or bone. It was a sound that vibrated up through the floorboards, a sickening percussion that synced with the frantic, terrified beating of my own heart. I could picture it perfectly. The upswing, the glint of metal in the moonlight, the devastating impact. The house was remembering, and it was forcing us to remember with it. Desperate, I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight, its powerful beam cutting through the oppressive gloom. I swept the light across the room, searching for something, anything, a weapon, another way out. The beam landed on the cloth-draped mirror above the fireplace. On the recorder, Kellerman had said they didn't like the light. Acting on pure instinct, I ripped the cloth away. For a split second, I saw only my own reflection, a wild-eyed, sweating man on the brink of madness. And then, standing directly behind me in the reflection, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with long, dark pigtails and a simple white nightdress. But her eyes were bottomless pits of black, ancient voids filled with a century of rage and sorrow. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, and the mirror cracked, a spiderweb of fractures spreading from her horrifying face. Maya shrieked, a raw animal sound of pure agony. The apparition in the mirror had turned its hollow gaze upon her. I saw her scramble backward, away from me, away from the mirror, her eyes wide with a terror that was no longer just about a haunted house. It was personal. Whatever was in that mirror, she had seen it before, or it had shown her something meant only for her. She crawled into the corner of the room, pulling her knees to her chest, her mind retreating to a place where the horrors couldn't follow. She had become a casualty, another victim of the house, her sanity bludgeoned just as surely as the bodies of the Moors. The ally I had depended on was gone, leaving me isolated with the giggling, malevolent children of the abyss. My attempts to escape, my reliance on reason, had all been useless. The house had its own rules, and the game had just begun. The whispers started again, this time from the attic. They were no longer taunting. They were crying. The final act of our torment was staged in the most claustrophobic, lightless space in the house, the attic. The sounds of weeping children drew me upward, a siren song of feigned innocence that my shattered mind was powerless to resist. Leaving Maya in her catatonic state felt like abandoning a part of myself, but the force pulling me up the stairs was irresistible. The attic hatch was a black square in the ceiling. As I pushed it open, a wave of palpable cold and despair washed over me, a stench of stagnant air and old sorrows. I pulled myself into the suffocating darkness. My flashlight beam cut a nervous, trembling path through the black. The air was thick with dust motes dancing in the light, like tiny, frantic spirits. And the whispers were everywhere. They weren't just in my ears. They were inside my head, a chorus of misery and malice. He's coming. Play with us. Forever. Then, the flashlight flickered and died. I was plunged into absolute, sensory-depriving blackness. The weeping stopped, replaced by a sound that would be forever burned into my memory. The heavy, labored breathing of a man, somewhere in the darkness with me. It was the sound of the killer, waiting patiently, just as he had waited a century ago. My sanity finally snapped. I was no longer Ethan, the journalist. I was a cornered animal. The whispers of the children and the breathing of the man blended with the phantom screams of the Moore family. I felt the touch of a small, icy hand on my neck. I screamed, thrashing wildly in the dark, falling backward over an old trunk. My head hit the floorboards with a sickening crack. In that moment of pain and disorientation, Robert Kellerman's last recorded words echoed in my mind. They don't like the light. But it was more than that. I remembered a detail from the local history. The killer had used a kerosene lamp, its wick turned down low. They weren't afraid of light itself. They were drawn to it. It was the focus of their energy, their stage. My flashlight had been a beacon, calling them to me. With the last shred of my will, I forced myself to stop screaming. I controlled my breathing, fighting back the tide of panic that threatened to drown me. I focused on a single, mundane memory. The taste of coffee on a sunny morning with Maya, the feel of her hand in mine as we walked through a park. I clung to that sliver of normalcy, that anchor to a world that was not this one. And the presence receded. The breathing faded. The whispers quieted. The oppressive cold lessened, just slightly. The confrontation wasn't about fighting them. It was about refusing to play their game, about starving them of the fear they craved. Scrambling on my hands and knees, I found the hatch and tumbled out of the attic, gasping the stale air of the second floor. I scooped up Maya, who was limp and unresponsive, a dead weight in my arms, and stumbled down the stairs. I didn't dare look at the mirrors. I threw my shoulder against the front door, and with a groan of splintering wood, it flew open. We collapsed onto the dew-soaked lawn as the first faint gray light of dawn began to stain the eastern sky. The house stood behind us, silent and still, its windows like vacant eyes watching us go. We had survived the night. But survival is not the same as victory. It's been 6 months since that night. I never wrote the story. The words wouldn't come. How can you explain the inexplicable? How can you describe the feeling of pure, primal dread to those who live safely in the light? Maya is a ghost of the woman she was. She rarely speaks, and when she does, it's in whispers. She can't sleep without every light in the house blazing, and she panics at the sound of a child's laughter. The doctors call it a profound psychological trauma. I know what it is. A part of her is still in that house, trapped in the dark with the weeping children. And me? I am a man forever marked. The world of facts and logic I once inhabited is a distant, half-forgotten memory. I now live with the terrible, unshakable knowledge that the veil between our reality and a much older, darker one is terrifyingly thin. I see things in the corners of my vision, the fleeting shadow of a small child, the glint of something sharp in the dark. I have become a witness to a truth I never wanted to know, that some places are so saturated with evil, they become wounds on the face of the world, and if you get too close, they leave a scar on your soul, a permanent reminder that the past is never dead, and it is most certainly not done playing its games. Some doors once opened can never be closed again,